The plains stretched out in silence, a sweep of gold and frost beneath a bruised sky. Evening light crawled slow across the land, spilling over the half-born settlement. 30 shacks crouched against the wind, a few chimneys coughing smoke that vanished almost as soon as it rose. The settlers had stopped their work early to watch the new man build. He stood in the middle of his lot, stacking stones so large it took his whole body to move each one. The thing he was shaping looked more like a fortress wall than a hearth. Nobody knew much about him. He had arrived 2 weeks before the first frost, with a wagon that leaned to one side and a family that looked like they'd already spent a winter on the road. His wife was narrow and quiet, her eyes the color of ash. His boy, maybe 8 or 9, watched everything, holding a small whittle bird that never left his hand. The man spoke little, and when he did, his voice carried a weight that made people stop talking afterward, like a church bell ringing in a storm. The blacksmith, a loud man who laughed to be heard, spat and said, "A hearth that big? He plans to roast a prairie, maybe." A few others chuckled, grateful for the excuse. "Could heat a whole saloon," another said. If he had sense, he'd use those stones for a wall, not a stove. The man didn't answer. His hammer fell again, steady and patient, sparks of sound rising with each strike. By dusk, the wind turned sharp. Most of the onlookers had gone home, leaving only a few diehards by the well. The man worked through the last of the light. The shape of the hearth stood taller than his shoulders, deep and wide as a wagon bed. Its mouth gaped open toward the plains like something waiting to breathe. He stepped back at last, rolling his shoulders, eyes reflecting the fading sun. Then he gathered his family inside their half-finished cabin. Later, when the town settled into darkness, one of the settlers crossed the road to toss feed to his mule. That's when he saw it, the glow, through the cracks in the cabin's boards. A furnace light poured out, orange and fierce. He could see them inside. The wife crouched by the fire, stirring something in a pot. The boy curled near the blaze, his face slack with sleep. The man sat before the hearth as if before an altar, elbows on his knees, staring into the flames like he was waiting for them to speak. The settler watched until his eyes hurt. The fire was too large for that small space. It made no sense that the roof didn't smoke or the walls didn't blacken. Yet the family seemed unbothered, wrapped in its warmth. When he told the others, they shook their heads. "He's touched," said one. "Maybe chased west by ghosts." But a few, remembering the hollow sound in his voice, wondered if it wasn't ghosts he was keeping away. In the days that followed, the man worked alone. He didn't join the others in hunting or in raising fences. He gathered wood from dawn till dusk, hauling it by hand, stacking it higher than a man's height beside the cabin. Every strike of his axe echoed across the settlement. When spoken to, he nodded once, polite but distant. It was the kind of silence that drew stories. Some said he'd burned his old house down. Others whispered that his family had come from a plagued town. Whatever the truth, no one cared enough to ask him to stop building his mountain of firewood. Winter was coming, and everyone had their own worries. One morning, the boy wandered toward the well where the settlers were drawing water. They tried to speak to him, asked if he liked to hear, if he missed the East, but he just held up his carved bird, as if that was answer enough. One woman bent closer and saw that its wings were scorched, though it blackened at the edges. When she asked about it, the boy only said, "It's for the fire, so it doesn't get lonely." She smiled uncertainly and watched him walk back toward the cabin, the bird cupped gently in his hands. That night, another wind came down from the hills. The sky turned the color of bruised steel. Doors rattled, the air bit through coats, and the few lanterns that burned outside flickered out one by one. Across the dark prairie, one house alone glowed like a coal, the man's. Through the slats of the walls, firelight spilled over the snow, steady and strong. The settlers lay awake in their own cold rooms, staring at the dull embers in their hearths, listening to the wind wail and thinking of that impossible blaze. Just before dawn, one of them swore he saw the man step outside, shirtless despite the cold, standing before the open mouth of the great hearth. The flames licked high enough to light his face, and for a moment he seemed carved from the same stone he had laid. He raised one hand toward the fire, either blessing it or pleading with it, and the wind seemed to die. The glow wavered, then steadied, burning cleaner than before. The man stood motionless for a long time, then turned back into the house. When the sun rose, the hearth smoke curled straight into the sky, a thin, silver line against the blue. The settlers went about their morning work with new quiet. None of them joked anymore. Something about that light, the way it had held through the storm, made them uneasy. Still, a few couldn't help glancing toward the cabin, toward that strange, patient fire. They didn't yet know it would soon be the only thing standing between them, and the kind of cold that never let go. The frost came sooner than anyone remembered. It crept in one night, while the moon was still thin and pale, covering the fields in a brittle glaze that sang underfoot. The ground hardened, the river slowed to a sluggish silver vein, and breath turned to fog before it left the lips. The settlers woke to find their wells crusted with ice and their animals huddled tight in the corners of their pens. By noon, the laughter that once drifted between the cabins had frozen out of the air. The cold had teeth, and it was already biting. The man with the great hearth was the only one whose chimney did not smoke in panic, but rather in rhythm, a steady, confident plume that rose against the colorless sky. While the rest of the town hurried to patch their roofs or seal their walls with mud, his cabin stood silent except for crackling within. The fire burned day and night. Some swore it never dimmed, as if the man had found a secret way to trap the sun. One afternoon, a desperate knock broke the rhythm of his solitude. It was a blacksmith, his wife, bundled in rag and fear, their little girl wrapped in a quilt so stiff with frost it crackled when she moved. "Stove's gone out," the blacksmith said, his breath a ghost in the doorway. "Wood's too wet. Can we just till morning?" The man said nothing at first. His eyes flicked to the woman and the shivering child. Then he stepped aside. The heat that met them inside was staggering. It was not the sharp warmth of firewood, but something fuller, deeper, like walking into summer. The woman began to cry before she realized she was doing it. The girl ran to the hearth and crouched near the blaze, holding her hands out and laughing through her chattering teeth. The man's wife moved silently, setting extra bowls by the pot that simmered on the stones. The boy sat nearby, his wooden bird glinting orange in the firelight. The blacksmith looked around the room, unsure whether to speak. Every surface seemed alive with light, shadows pulsing like heartbeats. Finally, he said, "I owe you." The man nodded once and returned to tending the flames. By nightfall, the storm returned. The wind battered the cabin walls like an angry thing. The blacksmith's wife slept with her child pressed close, both faces glowing in the firelight. The man sat before the hearth again, the way he always did when the wind rose, his back straight, his eyes locked on the heart of the flames. His wife watched him, her hands folded in her lap. After a while, she whispered, "You built it for them, didn't you?" He didn't look at her. "For them," he said quietly. "And for her?" The wind howled louder, carrying the sound of something moving beyond the door, low, guttural, uncertain. The blacksmith stirred, frowning. The boy sat up suddenly, listening. Then it came again, closer this time, a long, mournful cry that threaded through the night like a warning. Wolves, driven down from the hills by hunger and cold. The blacksmith stood, reaching for the hammer at his belt. The man raised a hand. "They won't come near," he said. "Not here." The others waited. Outside, claws scraped faintly against the frozen ground, circling. The man rose and pushed the door open. A wave of heat rolled out into the storm. In the glow, the wolves could be seen. 3, maybe 4, pacing the snow just beyond the light. Their eyes burned yellow, their ribs sharp beneath fur. The man took one step out, bare-chested despite the wind. The fire behind him surged higher, as if following him. The wolves froze, tails low. A moment later, they turned and slunk back into the dark. He came inside, closing the door with slow finality. No one spoke for a long time. The blacksmith's wife crossed herself without thinking. The boy looked at his father with wide, wondering eyes. The man only sat again, feeding another log to the fire. When dawn came, the storm had passed. Snow buried most of the settlement in a soft, deceptive stillness. The blacksmith left with his family. their faces red with warmth, their clothes steaming faintly as if they carried the fire with them. He turned once to look back at the house, smoke rising in a clean, unbroken line into the pale sky. He didn't say thank you again. Some debts were too large for words. Days turned to weeks. The cold deepened. The settlers began to fail in quiet ways. Soup thinning, roofs sagging, tempers shortening. At night, from their frostbitten homes, they could still see the faint red glow from the man's cabin. It became a promise in the dark, something to hold on to when the wind clawed at the windows. Eventually, another family came knocking. Then another. The man never turned anyone away. Each time, he stepped aside and let them enter, his wife silent beside him, his boy watching. The hearth grew crowded with faces, tired, hollow, seeking. They sat in that impossible warmth, feeling the life creep back into their fingers, the ache ease from their bones. When they left, they walked slower, as if reluctant to cross the threshold back into the frozen world. Rumors began to ripple through the settlement, that the fire never needed feeding, that its logs didn't burn down to ash, that if you listened closely, you could hear a second breath inside the flames. The man ignored them. He only tended his hearth, patient, unsmiling, the glow of it painting his face in strange relief, half light, half loss. One evening, as the boy drifted to sleep by the fire, the woman looked at her husband. "How long can it last?" she asked softly. He looked into the flames as though the answer might live there. "As long as it needs to," he said. Outside, the snow fell thicker, wrapping the world in silence. The settlers shuttered their windows and prayed for mercy, but their thoughts kept returning to that house at the edge of town, to the fire that refused to die. They did not yet understand that the same blaze that saved them could also consume what it loved most, and that before winter was done, the fire would demand something in return. The wind carried a sharp edge that cut across the plains, shaking the thin walls of the settlement like brittle paper. The man's cabin remained, as always, a beacon of warmth, smoke curling steadily from the great chimney, a silent challenge to the cold. Inside, the family moved with a rhythm that the settlers had begun to recognize, fetching wood, stirring pots, tending the fire, but there was a quiet weight in the man's eyes that no one could read. His hands were scarred and calloused, and sometimes, when he thought no one was looking, they trembled ever so slightly as he laid the next log into the roaring hearth. It was the boy who first asked the question that had been pressing at the edges of the man's mind. One morning, as snow drifted sideways outside and the wind rattled the cabin boards, the child leaned over the fire and asked, "Why do you keep it burning so big?" His voice was soft, curious, unafraid. The man crouched to meet him, eyes reflecting the amber flames. "For her," he said, "and for the life we lost." The boy tilted his head, holding the small carved bird close. "Will it make her warm?" The man's jaw tightened. He traced the rim of the hearth with one hand, as if measuring the distance between memory and now. "Only if we keep her flame alive," he murmured. It was not a story meant for the outside world, nor a confession. It was a vow. The boy nodded solemnly, as if he understood something far larger in the room around them. Outside, the settlers began to shift. The wind had grown relentless, forcing families to wander toward the warmth of the cabin despite their pride. One by one, they came, a mother with twins, an old man who could barely lift his arms, a hunter who had lost a leg to frostbite. The man never asked questions. He only opened the door wider and stepped aside. Inside, the hearth roared, each log feeding a heat that seemed impossible, and the room filled with murmurs of gratitude and relief. It was during one of these nights that the past began to settle in, thick as the smoke curling beneath the beams. The wife, usually quiet, moved near the hearth, tracing the firelight across the man's hands and face. "You left something behind in the east," she said softly. "Something that followed you." He paused, staring into the flames, and the room went quiet. The settlers who were seated on benches and crates sensed it too, though none could know the story. He saw the fever towns, the streets emptied of laughter, the small wooden coffins stacked in the snow. He remembered the pyre he had built when the earth was too frozen to hold them, the child who would never return to his arms. That fire had been mercy and punishment both, and the grief of it had followed him west, bundled in his family like the quilts on their beds. The boy shifted, tugging at his father's sleeve. Will she know he kept her warm? The man swallowed hard and pressed a hand to his son's shoulder. She will know, he said. Every night we burn, every spark we feed, she knows. The words hung in the air, mingling with smoke and warmth, and the boy sat back, satisfied with the answer, eyes closing as the hearth seemed to breathe around him. Word of the fire spread. The settlers, once scornful, now came to the edges of the cabin, staring through windows, feeling the heat from outside. Their hands had been numb, their faces pinched from frost, yet here was warmth and abundance. Slowly, they began to leave small offerings at the doorstep. Bundles of wood, dried meat, a handful of flour. There were no demands, no words of repayment. Just silent acknowledgement that the man's hearth was sustaining them in ways they had never imagined. One evening, as snow blanketed the town and the wind bent even the strongest timbers, the man stepped outside for a moment. He looked toward the horizon, where storm clouds gathered like restless spirits. The settlers watched from their homes, uncertain if the sight was meant as warning or simple observation. He did not speak, only turned back to the fire, placing another log carefully into the center of the blaze. Inside, the warmth spread like a living thing, pressing against every bone, reaching even into the hearts of the most skeptical. It was clear now that the hearth was more than stone and flame. It was a refuge, a guardian, a measure of human perseverance against the merciless cold. And yet there was tension in the air, subtle but undeniable. The man's eyes flicked often to the horizon, his jaw tight, his hands never idle. Even as he offered life to others, he knew the storm that was coming would demand its due. The settlers had begun to rely on him, though none dared admit the depth of their dependence. They carried their own fears and pride into the warmth, feeling a fragile safety that could vanish in a moment. And while the fire kept the cold at bay, it whispered its own warning, that survival came at a cost, and that the heat which saved them all could just as easily consume. That night, the man knelt by the hearth, the boy beside him, and together they fed in silence. The wife placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. Outside, the wind rose again, sharper than before, carrying the scent of distant snow and something darker beyond the ridges. The flames leapt higher, shadows dancing against the walls, and the settlers listened from their homes, knowing instinctively that whatever came next would test them all. The hearth had become a lifeline, and now it was ready to speak in ways none could yet imagine. The storm arrived with a fury that seemed impossible, sweeping across the plains like a living thing. Snow tore through the settlement in sheets, rattling roofs and whipping to the narrow streets, turning everything familiar into a blur of white. The wind howled like the cries of old ghosts, and the few animals still standing huddled in corners, shivering. The settlers, most of them unprepared, scrambled from house to house, fists pressed against doors, breath coming in ragged puffs, eyes wide with fear. Through it all, one house burned steady in defiance. The man's cabin glowed from within, a pillar of gold against the storm, the great hearth roaring louder than ever, as if feeding on the wind itself. Families who had been on the verge of despair staggered toward it, drawn by the warmth, the promise of life. They were soaked, numb, exhausted, but the fire inside seemed to reach out, embracing them with fierce insistence. The man threw open the doors without hesitation, letting everyone inside, pressing the warmth against frozen limbs and chilled hearts. The cabin swelled with a noise of relief and awe. Children clung to their mothers. Couples huddled together, and even the most skeptical settlers could not resist the heat. The man's wife moved among them silently, arranging blankets and setting pots closer to fire, while the boy sat near the blaze, holding his carved bird as if it were a talisman. The man fed the fire with careful precision, his hands steady, his eyes flicking to the storm beyond the cabin walls, watching, waiting, calculating. Then came the sound that made every heart in the room skip, a low, guttural growl from the edge of the snow. Wolves. The storm had driven them down from the hills, hungry and desperate. Their eyes gleamed like molten gold in the stormlight, their breath misting in the cold air. The settlers froze, panic rising, but the man did not flinch. He stepped forward, bare-chested, and placed his palm against the hearthstone. The fire surged, spilling heat and light outward, a living barrier that filled the cabin and pressed outward like a warning. The wolves circled, uneasy in the brilliance, their cries rising in frustration. One of them lunged forward, teeth bared, but the fire leapt in response, almost as though it understood. The animal froze, whined, and retreated into the storm. One by one, the pack slunk back, fading into the blizzard, leaving silence behind except for the roar of the flames. The settlers exhaled in unison, some trembling, others silent with disbelief. The man returned inside, wet hair clinging to his forehead, his chest heaving not from exertion, but from the steady discipline of survival. He pressed another log into the hearth, and the fire seemed to breathe with him. The wife moved beside him, her hand brushing his arm. "It's doing more than keeping us warm," she said softly. "It's keeping them away." He nodded, eyes still on the flames. "It protects life," he said. "But nothing can protect it forever. Not the fire, not us." The storm raged on through the night. Inside, the settlers huddled, wrapped in blankets and the glow of the hearth. The boy leaned against his father's knee. The carved bird clutched tight, eyes heavy with sleep, but wide with understanding. They knew instinctively that this fire was alive in ways beyond wood and stone, a force born of loss and endurance. Every flicker of flame seemed to carry memory, hope, and warning all at once. At dawn, the blizzard passed. The settlement emerged into a world of white. The plains flattened under snow, each cabin dusted in powder. They approached the man's home with cautious awe, expecting ruin. But the hearth remained. Smoke curled lazily from the chimney, the stones glowing faintly even in daylight. The cabin itself was intact, though singed in places from the intensity of the night. Inside, the fire still burned, steady and defiant, as if it had been expecting the storm all along. The settlers looked around, their faces a mixture of fear, gratitude, and wonder. The boy pressed the carved bird into his chest, kneeling by the hearth. The wife placed her hand over his small one, and together they watched the remaining embers. For a long moment, there was only silence. Then one of the settlers whispered, "I guess it wasn't a joke after all." The man stood, shoulders squared, watching the horizon where storm clouds had gathered and dissipated, sensing the fragile peace that now rested over the town. The fire had given them warmth, safety, and life, but had demanded vigilance, courage, and faith in return. He turned to his family, their faces lit by the golden glow, and for the first time allowed himself a brief exhale, a quiet acknowledgement of survival against impossible odds. Outside, the plains glimmered under the early sun, each flake of snow catching the light, reflecting the endurance of those who had weathered the night. The settlers began to move again, cautiously, respectfully, toward their own homes, hearts tempered by what they had witnessed. The man returned to his hearth, kneeling before it once more, feeding the flames, and for a moment, the world beyond the cabin seemed smaller, colder, irrelevant. The fire continued to burn, unwavering, a living monument to loss, perseverance, and protection. And as the settlers watched on the edge of the clearing, they understood something simple and terrifying. Some warmth once lit refuses to die, and those who rely upon it are forever changed. The boy placed his bird beside the fire, its wings blackened but intact, and whispered, "We'll keep it alive." The man's wife smiled faintly, tears glinting in the light. The man pressed a hand to the hearthstone, feeling the pulse of heat against his palm, and nodded. Outside, the plains stretched white and endless, but inside, the fire spoke of life, memory, and the unyielding strength of those who dare to face the storm.